An abandoned prison in the corner of a once lively Gerudo desert. A prison that undoubtedly housed a Ganon in the past, and where a huge skeleton lay in rest, unknowingly coming to the end of its slumber. A temple underneath the biggest water source in all of Hyrule, a temple that can only be described as being on a lake bed. Giant monsters lay in wait for Hero after being called upon by the usurper king. A sort of mansion that sits in the middle of the Lost Woods, seemingly lost for all eternity, while the hero of time seeks to vanquish the phantom that plagues the mansion's walls. And finally, a monster roams around the top of a snow-ridden mountain. This monster hasn't been seen eye to eye by the residents nearby reporting it. The hero walks up the mountain in search of the next shard for the Mirror of Twilight. The monster stares Link down with giant eyes and invites him to slide down the other side of the mountain. While sliding, the hero looks down to see yet another giant house sat at the foot of the snow. The atmosphere set is of course tranquil, but eerie atmosphere. Almost as if the walls of the house are talking to you while you help the sick monster's wife. Now, before I end up describing every dungeon in the series, we should probably start actually talking about the topic I'm here to discuss today. What actually makes a good Zelda dungeon? All of the dungeons that I've just described, Arbiter's Grounds, Lakebed Temple, the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time, Snow Peak Ruins, all of those dungeons have one thing in common. They're all regarded as great dungeons. Lakebed Temple is one that's up for debate in my experiences, but the point still stands. They're all just great dungeons, they're great experiences. So, what are some other things that are common in all of them? Well, that's really up for you to decide. Every single person has their own expectations for Zelda dungeons. Zelda's great in that way. If you ask 5 different people what their favourite Zelda dungeon is, every single person will have a different opinion. There is not a single dungeon in the series that you can call objectively the best. So before I overextend this intro, tell me in the comments what makes a Zelda dungeon good for you. First of all, I would like to talk about atmosphere. Atmospherically, I feel that dungeons have always ranged from being extremely eerie to having sort of a tranquil, relaxed sort of vibe about them. A great example of these two extremes are of course present in the Ancient Cistern from Skyward Sword. This dungeon is regarded as the best dungeon in that game. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Skyward Sword, but even I recognise that the Ancient Cistern was a good dungeon. So, what made the Ancient Cistern good? Well, for me it was definitely the atmosphere. You see, the game had you venture through 2 different sub-areas through your adventure. These 2 areas had extremely different atmospheres. First of all, let's talk about the peaceful, sort of serene atmosphere of the top side. As you walk into a colossal structure, you're hit with a giant Buddhist-like statue with a huge body of water sectioning you off from that statue. Lily pads circle the area. These can be flipped around, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that the game was clearly trying to create a nice atmosphere, something that you could even fall asleep to. I've been playing the backing track to this dungeon in the background and I bet you failed to hear it initially. It's just that calming. So calm that you don't even have to think about it. However, the dungeon isn't all flowers and dandelions, no. It takes a sinister turn somewhere in the middle of the dungeon. The ground turns cold, the water runs fast, the calm feelings are gone. All that's left is the crippled remains of what would have once been a prospering area below the statue. And in fact, there is of course one thing that resembles the soothing music of the area before. The music becomes twisted, becoming possibly one of the most nightmare-inducing orchestrations of video game music to some people. This will build into one giant picture in a little bit, but I think that the reason the dungeon is so often called one of the best dungeons ever made is because of this contrast. There is a certain amount of lore that is also given by the dungeon. But to the casual player, the reason why this dungeon is so good is because of the fact that the top side is so calm. Not even a mouse roams around the giant walls you're enclosed in. But then you take a deep dive into a malice-infested abyss that can slowly eat away at the player's sanity before seeing the light and slowly climbing a rope that resembles a lot of what we go through in real life. I really must actually talk about how the atmosphere affects how good a Zelda dungeon is in general though, but I really do think that the Ancient Cistern is one of the best forms of atmosphere in a Zelda dungeon. Perhaps it's more testament to the structure of it, but the atmosphere really enthralled me. So, as I just said, to what extent does the atmosphere of a dungeon affect my enjoyment of that dungeon? Well, everyone's taste in dungeons vary greatly, but personally there's a reason why I decided to talk about atmosphere first. If I'm really enjoying a Zelda game, I will want to be immersed into my dungeons, especially since they are the key elements at the centre of Zelda. Being immersed into a game really affects my enjoyment, which means if I think a dungeon has a good atmosphere, it will officially be a good dungeon in my eyes. It's one of a lot of factors that create a good dungeon in my opinion. The next thing that I think creates a truly interesting dungeon in my opinion is the items. Technically speaking, items are truly their own sort of entity. To some of you who have only played Breath of the Wild and haven't even dipped your toes into the old formula of gameplay, the more linear, concise progression, one of the main points of this progression was definitely the items. In Breath of the Wild, in essence, we're given all of the items that we need for the rest of the game in one fell swoop. Cryonis, Magnesis, Stasis, and Remote Bombs are all unlocked after a few hours of gameplay. Well, if you're now new to how the old games worked, the items were given to you incrementally over long periods of time. Each dungeon held a new item. Once you got out the dungeon, this item could then sometimes open up new parts of the world. This started being less true as Skyward Sword came out, as the game was so linear, but I digress. A perfect example of a dungeon that was made substantially better by simply an item is the infamous Stone Tower Temple. This temple saw the player venture through a decent dungeon, like it was kinda big I guess, but the dungeon opens up completely after the Hero of Time picks up the light arrows from the chest after defeating a Goro. But how does a set of arrows change the dungeon a lot? Well, in this rather unusual case, when light arrows are shot at a corresponding red gem, the entire dungeon flips upside down. The key here is that the dungeon was designed to be played right way around and also upside down. Personally, I don't love the Stone Tower Temple. However, I know that I'm very much in the minority here. So many people love the Stone Tower Temple purely because of this fact. The fact that you can flip the dungeon is a genuine thing that they love about the dungeon. Not to mention the fact that light arrows are possibly the most important item in pretty much any of Link's adventures in which they appear. Now, let's move away from my evidence of items making dungeons better now though, as there's a lot of aspects that go into what exactly makes an item specifically good for a certain dungeon. Some of these aspects are whether they actually add anything to the dungeon. Like in Dodongo's Cavern, in Ocarina of Time, the bombs open up a lot of areas around the cave. Another thing that suits an item to a dungeon is if they're new, more original, if they're substantial enough to pop up in more games in the future. This seems like a good time to revisit the bombs in Dodongo's Caverns, as bombs aren't exactly the coolest thing in the world. I mean, let's be honest. They're almost in every single Zelda game. Even stinking Breath of the Wild for Pete's sake, and that got rid of pretty much every other item. However, a good example of this would be the ball and chain seen within the Snow Peak ruins. While a ball and chain isn't exactly new in real life, it's extremely new in the Zelda universe. So taking the ball and chain from an enemy and destroying the dungeon's boss and ice disciples with it is extremely empowering and overall increases my enjoyment of Snow Peak an amount that I'm almost embarrassed of. A dungeon's design and structure are extremely important, of course, but a dungeon's item is the cherry on top of the cake. It's probably one of the main reasons why people didn't like Breath of the Wild's dungeons as much as the traditional temples and caves because of that item progression. Now of course there was that long section on atmosphere before all the item talk, but something that really should stand by itself in the dungeon world and something that really boosts the significance of these monuments is the theming. At the beginning of the video, I described a few of my personal favourites in the series, and one of the main things that you would have grasped from those descriptions is that each of those dungeons all had a separate identity, and in my opinion that is really a key element in a Zelda game. Not even just in the dungeons. Heck, you can even differentiate most dungeons in the Zelda series by simply listening to a few different descriptions. Even the dungeons that are named the same thing. Just listen to this. The Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time was set in a giant mansion, covered in moss from head to toe, exceptionally well crafted by whichever entities or people had originally changed the ground from dirt to stone. Poes roam around the dark halls, while the Hero of Time searches for them. Now as I mentioned, that was the Forest Temple in Ocarina of Time. Now let's move on to the Forest Temple in Twilight Princess. Much like the other Forest Temple, creatures roam around the halls, monkeys trapped in cages awaiting the Hero of Twilight to come save them. As Link takes a look into his surroundings, the trees twist and turn into logs. The clearing on the other edge of the trees invite the hero to use a boomerang held by a rather cheeky baboon. The fact that these two themes are so similar, but are yet just so different, really makes me think about how they achieved this amount of just pure difference. There's something extremely special about any dungeon with theming. To me personally, it is just a complete necessity when making a Zelda dungeon. For example, something that I am less inclined in liking are the dungeons in Breath of the Wild. I do want to stop talking so badly on the Divine Beasts, and will do in my next section. But even now, I must admit that when initially viewing them, you have a significant difference in identity. I mean, one of them is a bird, one is an elephant, one's a camel, and one's a spider lizard thing. But inside of the dungeons, the theming was sort of lackluster in my opinion. Each had different background music, but I just think that they all looked very samey. But that was definitely intentional from the designers. That being said, it was definitely less inclined in being something that I invested myself in personally, but perhaps you think differently to me. The point is that theming can really spice up a dungeon. As already talked about, the music also affects the theming, but I feel like I've probably already talked about the music way too much as it is. The point is that being able to look around a huge room and clearly being able to tell what the theme of the dungeon is within a second, even if it is one of the dreaded water temples from one of the many linear Zelda games, you know, the ones that come to mind are the Water Temple and the Great Bay Temple. Both are extremely difficult in areas, though they are much easier on second playthroughs, but both of the dungeons' theming are amazing. Who looked at the Water Temple or Great Bay Temple and thought, this is a desert temple, or something like that? No one, because their theming gives them a solid identity. Themed dungeons are really the traditional way, and I must say that I hope they go back to themed dungeons in Breath of the Wild 2. Now, as I said in the last section, I feel that it's probably time to heap some praise onto the Divine Beasts, especially since I feel like I'll accidentally dunk on them again soon. So what did those dungeons do better than any other dungeon in the series? Well, unlike many things in the Divine Beasts, the puzzles were absolutely amazing, and while I appreciate combat and puzzling in my dungeons, I will say that the puzzles were just glorious. Not only was each and every one of them just plain smart, they were all extremely open. Much like the game that they're seen in. For example, in previous games I absolutely loved the puzzles, and I loved how there was just one answer to the puzzle. You move a block into place, you're done. You change the angle of your mirror shield ever so slightly and it changed the layout of the dungeon. I could go on and on about the old dungeons, but I'm here to say some good stuff about Breath of the Wild. While I loved the old puzzle format, Breath of the Wild just did it way better in my opinion. Magnesis, Cryonis, Stasis and Remote Bombs really made you think about which item you should apply into each situation the game puts you in. For example, in Divine Beast Valruta, the puzzles are more centered around Cryonis, and while some of these puzzles are fairly nice, the main priority is definitely the controlling of the beast. You can control the trunk of Varuta to spray water to different areas, or allow Link easy access to the end of the beast trunk. This made for some extremely interesting puzzles. But why do puzzles make dungeons good for me? Well, inside of dungeons, puzzling normally makes up around 50% of the experience in the older games. But being able to just jump into any of the monoliths the game throws you into and throwing in some puzzles makes for some good old-fashioned tremendous fun in my opinion. The puzzles add such a good amount of personality to each and every one of the dungeons, as sometimes they can lean into the theming. For examples, the puzzles in Wind Waker's Dragon Rouge Cavern has some semblance of theming, as a lot of the puzzles were centered around the main idea of using fire. Throwing a wooden stick that was alight at another bit of wood causes the fire to burn. Each dungeon before Breath of the Wild have puzzles that have personality. That's the main idea I'm getting at, and for me, that creates a quote-unquote good dungeon. Now, what is the next 50% of the dungeons that I haven't spoken about yet? Well, in my opinion, it's most definitely the combat. While the combat system itself seen in each Zelda game aren't anything to do with the dungeons in a sense, I also think they really bring the enjoyment factor up a notch. For example, being able to stab your sword into Bokoblin's chests in Twilight Princess greatly expanded upon my overall enjoyment of each dungeon, whereas the lack of this sort of feature in the Wind Waker definitely lowered my enjoyment, causing me to sometimes even be frustrated as an enemy sits on the floor waiting to be killed. That being said, Wind Waker is still an amazing game in its own right, even if I have been on the other end of a debate against it before. The thing is, the combat system itself is not the only thing to consider here. No, when discussing combat in Zelda dungeons we have to talk about enemies, mini-bosses, and of course bosses, because as already stated, good theming counts for something in Zelda games. And just imagine if the ice enemies in Snow Peak Ruins were seen in the Goron mines or something, it just wouldn't work correctly. So, as I've done with pretty much every single topic in this video, let's find a good case study that properly identifies good theming and also correctly uses all of its enemies in that aspect. And of course for this we can look no further than the Arbiter's Grounds in Twilight Princess. First of all, the lore behind the dungeon is magnificent. It was in my description at the beginning of the video and has some of the best lore in the series housed within it in my opinion. Since I'm not actually going to talk about lore in this video, I will just say now that lore in a dungeon is important to me. Next, you make your way inside, and of course there are just some excellent enemies for the area. Gibdos, Poes, even these little invisible bug things. Gibdos are probably the most popular of all these different enemies though. They're basically just Egyptian Redeads. I'm not going to go any further into the Red Dead Gibdo situation though, as many people have way too many strong opinions on that stuff. The point is that using these dark enemies in such a dark dungeon fit the theme perfectly, and increased my enjoyment in this case dramatically. Poes are similar in this regard, as they are literally ghosts with scythes that can only be killed by Wolf Link because they're invisible. And please, for the love of God, do not get me started on the invisible bugs. These things are both a curse and a blessing. Amazing thematically, but just extremely annoying in practice. Overall, enemies in the Arbiter's Grounds are just perfectly fit. to the point where it's difficult to find a dungeon with better themed enemies. Speaking of amazingly fit enemies, I think it's time to talk about Death Sword. I can't even begin to discuss how good the lore is to this mini-boss. It might just have the best lore for any mini-boss in the series. People speculate it was Ganon's sword, and not to mention the fact that the ghost wielding it is gigantic, terrifying, and requires Wolf-Link to be able to see him because he's invisible. It's groundbreaking how cool this mini-boss actually is, just amazing stuff in my opinion. Last off, the boss in this dungeon, and oh my god, ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a treat. Objectively a top 5 or top 10 boss, and personally my favourite boss in the series. Star-Lord is just such an epic final boss, a giant dragonoid figure that's resurrected by the Usurper King Zant. Many speculate that Star-Lord could somehow be linked to Valu, and while I don't personally believe that, I think that's the thought that counts sometimes. The boss fight itself is amazing. Using a spinner to break the spine of Star-Lord is already a ton of fun, but once you've taken down the main sections of this colossal creature, he just decides, nah, I'm gonna be a head now, and it's just kinda a floaty head guy. He chases Link around a circular platform over and over, and this is the type of tension that I just love in video games. Star-Lord is just such an epic boss, and with him being a skeleton, he fits with the rest of the dungeon's theme, as bones have been scattered all over the place in this dungeon. I am almost certain that I don't even have to talk about why I like combat in these dungeons so much. The Arbiter's Grounds was just such a perfect example that there's a chance that I've left you wanting to play or replay the dungeon yourself, which is something that I'd like to do now, so I think it's time to get to my conclusion. To conclude this video, I'm going to ask you and myself one simple question. What makes a good Zelda dungeon? I know you made that decision at the start of the video when you commented, but really think about it this time. Pause the video if you have to, and reply to your previous comment. The funny thing is, I have covered nowhere near all of the aspects that I love in past Legend of Zelda dungeons. In fact, I would say that I'm much closer to half if anything. There are just so many different aspects, and what makes a Zelda dungeon good to me? Well, that's the thing, it's the experience of all of these different aspects culminating together to really bring together the perfect experience. But if I had to pick a single thing, always atmosphere. But I know that in the comments all of you will have vastly different opinions to each other and me, and that is really the point that I'm trying to make here. Every single person has different opinions on their Zelda dungeons. Even if you prefer Breath of the Wild's dungeons, you still prefer something different. And that's the beautiful thing about the dungeons. If we can all talk about them on a civil level while having different opinions, then there are just some great opinions to be had. And that's probably why I believe the dungeons are just so special. And with everything done, all I can say is thank you. While scripting this, I recognise that this will be my longest video by quite an interesting margin. And that just excites me. This is a topic that I'm extremely passionate about, and if you made it to the end of the video, then just thank you. Let me know whether you made it to the end by telling me in the comments. If you don't want to tell me, then that's fine. Remain anonymous. If you did manage to sit through this entire video, then please do leave a like rating and subscribe now, and do not forget to press that bell as you'll want to see when my new videos go up, since I'm doing more midweek videos now. If you'd like to join all of these amazing people on screen, thank you all for the continued support by the way, then please do consider donating to my Patreon if you can and of course want to. Any amount helps out the channel and you get some benefits yourselves, so thank you. Links in the description. Along with that is the rest of my social media. Everything you need is down there, so thank you so much for watching this video. As an aside, I think it might not be a well-performing video down to the length and topic as Age of Calamity is out now, but I just needed to talk about it. So please stay safe, and I'll see you all next week for your next Zelda fix. Thank you all so much for sticking around.